Breathe softly. Allow your shoulders to drop, releasing the tensions of the day. In this space of stillness, let us turn our gaze inward, not to the silence of the cosmos, but to the silence that resides between us. We speak of a profound, pervasive tension that exists at the very heart of human connection, the quiet war. This is not the thunderous clash of armies, nor the overt conflict reported in headlines. This war is subtle. It is fought not with weapons, but with reserved words, protective silences, and the gentle, persistent pressure of expectation. It is a quiet, continuous struggle for safety, understanding, and autonomy that plays out daily between men and women. The deepest paradox of the human experience lies here. We are fundamentally wired for connection, for the warmth of partnership, the intimacy of shared vulnerability, and the synergy of complementary strengths. Yet this very connection is shadowed by a foundational, often unspoken fear. Why, in the history of all creatures, do the two halves of our species, destined to seek and complete one another, harbor such a deep, cautious reserve? Why does the impulse to embrace so often compete with the instinct to pull back? This quiet war is defined by a central fear, the fear of the other's power to hurt. For one half, the fear often centers on vulnerability. It is the dread of being exposed, of having one's protective mask of self-sufficiency shattered, only to be met with judgment or emotional distance. It is the fear that their deep-seated need for respect and competence might be overlooked, or worse, used against them. This results in the construction of emotional fortresses, walls built of silence, control, and deflection, to guard against perceived emotional invasion. For the other half, the fear often revolves around autonomy and safety. It is the pervasive dread of losing one's voice, of being constrained by an external will, or of having one's intrinsic worth marginalized. It is the fear that their need for security and validation might be manipulated or dismissed. This leads to the development of finely tuned defensive mechanisms, tools of observation, emotional forecasting, and guarded communication to maintain self-preservation. This mutual defense mechanism creates the battlefield of the quiet war. We look at the other and see not a partner, but a potential threat to our core identity or safety. The war is quiet because it is internalized. It manifests not in shouting matches, but in the things left unsaid, in the topics meticulously avoided at the dinner table, in the moments of vulnerability swiftly retracted, in the unspoken calculation of risk before sharing a simple, honest feeling. We have inherited this conflict. It is woven into the fabric of our socialization, passed down through cultural narratives and historical roles that predate us. The past has codified the relationship between men and women as one of asymmetrical power. And even as modern society strives for equality, the deep, emotional scar tissue remains. This lingering shadow of history whispers constantly, be careful. Protect yourself. The other has the power to define, to limit, or to destroy what you hold most dear. But we must realize that the silence is the problem, not the solution. This quiet fear is the wedge that separates us, turning potential partners into necessary adversaries. It drains the energy from our relationships, leaving them functional but emotionally barren. To truly understand this war, we must dismantle the barriers and examine their origins. In the next unit, we will delve into the personal and psychological architecture of this fear, analyzing the internal pressure each gender faces and how these burdens prevent us from seeing the humanity in the other. Remain present. Let the tension of this recognition settle gently within you. Settle deeper into your stillness. Let the soft, ambient quality of the narrative guide you inward, where the personal wars are fought in silence. The fear that drives the quiet war begins not in external interaction, but in internal conviction. Each gender is burdened by a profound cultural instruction manual, a set of non-negotiable expectations that define worth. The fear, therefore, is ultimately the dread of failing this mandate in the presence of the other. The burden of competence, the male fear for one half. The psychological root is the fear of fragility. This fear is born from a long-standing cultural mandate of competence, stoicism, and unwavering self-reliance. The internal voice whispers that value is conditional on capability. Therefore, the greatest threat in the presence of a partner is not physical attack, but the emotional strike of feeling inadequate. To be truly seen in a moment of emotional helplessness, professional failure, or personal uncertainty is perceived as exposing a fatal vulnerability. The emotional response is often a swift, defensive withdrawal. The moment intimacy demands a display of raw feeling, the internal siren sounds, signaling that the defensive walls must be fortified. This fear leads to the creation of the impenetrable mask. The male response to quiet fear is often closure. He fears the partner's capacity to see his soft underbelly and judge him as less than. This judgment, whether real or imagined, threatens the very foundation of his identity, his ability to provide, to solve, and to remain emotionally stable. When vulnerability is perceived as a weakness the other might exploit, silence becomes the ultimate protective gear. He retreats into a fortress of logic or stoic reservation, not out of malice, but out of a desperate need to preserve his perceived integrity. The cost of connection, the female fear for the other half. The psychological root is the fear of absorption, the deep-seated dread of losing one's unique identity within the framework of a relationship. This fear is born from a historical and social mandate that often subordinates personal ambition to relational harmony. The internal voice suggests that connection is conditional on compliance. The greatest threat is not incompetence, but the sense that one's voice, perspective, or unique trajectory will be minimized, erased, or sacrificed for the stability of the union. This fear leads to the creation of the emotional guard. The female response to quiet fear is often precautionary guardedness. She fears the partner's unintentional capacity to define her identity, to make her life orbit his needs, his career, or his definitions of success. This dread is a direct legacy of historical imbalance, where personal aspiration was frequently considered secondary. When intimacy demands a full surrender to the relationship, the internal alarm signals the danger of dissolving into the other. She maintains an emotional reserve, not out of coldness, but out of a fierce, protective need to safeguard her boundaries and retain her self-defined value. The clash of two solitudes. These two separate yet coexisting fears create the perfect climate for the quiet war. The seeker of control, fear of fragility, attempts to solve, fix, or contain emotional turbulence by withdrawing or intellectualizing. The seeker of autonomy, fear of absorption, interprets this withdrawal as a lack of emotional commitment, a confirmation that her feelings or needs are secondary, a prelude to being erased. The result is a devastating misunderstanding. He sees her demand for emotional depth as a threat to his competence. She sees his withdrawal as a threat to her existence. Neither truly sees the human being across the divide. They only see the reflection of their deepest, most private fears. The silence that ensues is not peace. It is the sound of two solitary souls building higher walls, each believing they are simply defending themselves against an inevitable attack from the other. In the next unit, we will step outside the personal psyche and examine how this psychological fear is amplified and enforced by external cultural forces. The social scripts and inherited trauma that tell us who we should be and why we should be afraid remain settled. This realization is the first step toward releasing the psychological burden. Allow your breathing to deepen, becoming slow and regular. This exploration requires a clear mind, free from the constraints of learned assumptions. The fears analyzed in the previous unit, the fear of fragility and the fear of absorption, are not spontaneously generated. They are meticulously cultivated by the scripts handed to us from birth, the social stereotypes that dictate what it means to be a complete man or a complete woman. These cultural molds, often passed down through generations of tradition, media, and even simple nursery tales, establish rigid, narrow definitions of worth. The man, the script of the unwavering pillar society, prescribes the role of the unwavering pillar for men. This script mandates that emotional stability, economic prowess, and decisiveness are not mere traits, but moral obligations. Any deviation, a moment of open doubt, a need for emotional support, or a failure to fix a problem, is registered internally as a betrayal of the script. The burden is immense, leading to a constant, internal vigilance against revealing any weakness. When the female partner seeks emotional connection or demands vulnerability, the man often interprets this not as a sign of love, but as a demand to drop his shield. Since the shield is equated with his social value, the request for intimacy is perceived as a threat to his very identity. This leads to the classic defensive action in the quiet war, the stoic retreat. He retreats to the safe ground of logic or solitude, where his mask of competence can remain unbroken, preserving the social script at the expense of emotional closeness. The woman, the script of the emotional conductor. Conversely, society often prescribes the role of the emotional conductor for women. This script mandates that emotional intuition, relational harmony, and selfless nurturing are paramount. The internal pressure centers on the need to maintain relational perfection. Any failure to foresee a conflict, any direct expression of anger or need, or any focus on personal ambition over familial care can be internally registered as a failure of femininity. When the male partner withdraws into his unwavering pillar persona, the woman often interprets this as an emotional failure on her part, a signal that she has failed to generate enough warmth or safe space to keep him engaged. This confirms her greatest fear, that her primary value, emotional connection, is insufficient or easily dismissed. This dynamic generates the quiet accumulation of resentment. She fears direct, aggressive confrontation because the script tells her to prioritize harmony. Instead, the tension festers beneath the surface, communicated through subtle passive resistance, or through the dreaded language of "I'm fine," which is anything but. The media's echo chamber. This psychological conflict is amplified by the echo chamber of modern media. For men, media often portrays women as complex, demanding, and ultimately unknowable emotional riddles, reinforcing the belief that emotional dialogue is a trap that will lead to certain failure. For women, media often portrays men as emotionally illiterate, fundamentally unreliable, or only redeemable through the sheer emotional labor of the female protagonist, reinforcing the belief that deep vulnerability will be met with incomprehension or rejection. This continuous reinforcement of stereotypes creates a vicious cycle. The fear of the stereotype causes the withdrawal, and the withdrawal confirms the stereotype in the mind of the other. The quiet war is thus sustained by a shared cultural narrative of antagonism. To achieve peace, we must first learn to discard the scripts, to look at the person across from us as an individual, not as a representative of a historically burdened gender role. In our next unit, we will delve deeper into the historical and power dynamics that underpin these roles, examining how the legacy of past inequalities continues to create invisible barriers of fear today. Let your mind absorb this analysis of external pressure. The silence is the space for these cultural assumptions to be questioned. Rest your mind. Allow the echoes of the past to resonate gently without turbulence. The quiet war is not merely a clash of personalities or cultural stereotypes. It is a profound inheritance. Relationships today are not built on a neutral foundation, but upon strata of historical power dynamics that have institutionalized certain fears over millennia. This is the legacy of power asymmetry. When one group has historically held disproportionate institutional, economic, and social authority, it creates a psychological record of mistrust and vulnerability that cannot be erased by a single generation's effort. This legacy manifests as two distinct, yet interconnected types of fear that keep the war quiet, yet continuous. The fear of the dominant, the burden of guilt and responsibility for the group that has historically held the position of dominance. The fear is often subtle and deeply internalized. The fear of accountability. This fear is not necessarily a conscious dread of personal wrongdoing, but a psychological burden of collective historical responsibility. When conversations turn toward past injustices, systemic privilege, or the need for fundamental change, the instinctual response is often to defend and resist. This defense springs from the fear that accepting the legitimacy of the past grievance will lead to the total destruction of current identity or status. The fear whispers, if I acknowledge my structural advantage, I risk losing everything I have built, and I risk being judged as inherently flawed or oppressive. This psychological burden results in emotional resistance to vulnerability. A man may resist listening to a woman's pain, not because he lacks empathy, but because that pain is perceived as an accusation that threatens his sense of being a good or fair person. To lower his defenses and truly listen to the historical echo in her voice feels like signing a confession. He resorts to silence, deflection, or intellectual argument, actions designed to preserve psychological innocence, thus intensifying the Cold War. The fear of the subordinated. The fear of recurrence and control for the group that has historically been subjected to structural subordination. The fear is often visceral and hypervigilant. The fear of recurrence. This fear is a deep-seated caution that historical patterns of control, minimization, or outright marginalization will inevitably repeat themselves. Every act of thoughtlessness, every moment of perceived dismissal is measured against the historical record. The fear whispers, any surrender of autonomy, any genuine display of trust, is a risk that the protective boundaries will be breached and the control will return. This psychological trauma results in skepticism toward gestures of peace. A woman may find it difficult to fully trust genuine vulnerability from a male partner, not because she distrusts him as an individual, but because she distrusts the structural power he represents. Her hypervigilance, her need to constantly observe, predict, and emotionally prepare, is a necessary defense mechanism refined by generations who had little recourse against institutional power. This vigilance makes genuine, effortless intimacy difficult to sustain, fueling the tension. The mutual struggle for security. Ultimately, the quiet war is not a fight for dominance today. It is a mutual struggle for psychological security. One side seeks security in preserving their autonomy and avoiding past control. The other side seeks security in preserving their status and avoiding collective historical guilt. The tragedy is that the tools used to achieve security, silence, defensiveness, and hypervigilance, are precisely the tools that destroy security for the partner. The walls built for protection become the prisons that isolate us from the understanding we crave. The silence that separates us is therefore the heavy sound of historical inertia. It is the ghost of inequality demanding to be seen, acknowledged, and finally laid to rest. We have now completed our analytical journey, diagnosing the war from its personal, social, and historical roots. In the next phase of our reflection, we will move beyond analysis to synthesis, examining this tension through a purely philosophical and human lens. Relax. The hardest truths are often the quietest. Breathe evenly. Let your consciousness soften its focus, moving from rigid analysis to fluid contemplation. The quiet war persists because we treat it as a gendered problem, when in reality it is a universal human problem expressed through gendered roles. The deepest fear on both sides is the same, the fear of rejection after total exposure. When we look across the divide at our partner, the image we see is heavily filtered by our personal history. This partner becomes a mirror of shared vulnerability. What one half fears is loss of self-worth via judgment of incompetence. What the other half fears is loss of self-worth via absorption and erasure. The mechanism is identical. It is the dread of being fundamentally diminished by the very person chosen for elevation. The illusion of two separate fears. Consider the man who builds a fortress of stoicism, fearing that any expression of grief or doubt will shatter his image of strength. When he perceives his female partner as emotionally demanding or turbulent, he is not just reacting to her. He is reacting to the forbidden fragility within himself. Her openness is a challenging mirror, forcing him to confront the emotional capacity he has been culturally mandated to suppress. His quiet withdrawal is less about rejecting her, and more about rejecting the exposed man she reflects. Conversely, consider the woman who adopts a stance of hypervigilance, fearing that her career or intellectual ambition will be dismissed in favor of her domestic role. When she perceives her male partner as stubbornly, controlling, or emotionally absent, she's reacting to the historical shadow of power that threatens to minimize her voice. Her quiet skepticism is less about mistrusting him, and more about protecting the ambition she has fought so hard to cultivate, the very ambition that he, too, may have been taught to suppress in favor of providing. The mirror shows us that our perceived aggressor is merely a host for the emotion we ourselves are terrified of exhibiting. Unadorned need, vulnerability as radical strength, the core philosophical shift required to dismantle the quiet war lies in redefining strength. Strength, as traditionally taught, is the ability to withstand and resist the other. It is the fortress wall, the unyielding stance, the mask of competence. This false strength is what necessitates the war. It keeps the defenses permanently high. True strength, however, is the courage to surrender the fortress. It is the willingness to be seen flawed, doubting, and incomplete without a defensive narrative. Vulnerability is not weakness. It's the most radical act of courage a person can perform in the face of the historical and cultural tensions we have inherited. When one person risks genuine vulnerability, they are not handing the other a weapon. They are handing the other a mirror. They are saying, I drop my defenses, and in doing so, I give you the freedom to drop yours. This shift from seeing vulnerability as a risk of being hurt to seeing it as the sole pathway to true connection is the philosophical key to peace, from role to entity. Most profound realization in this reflection is the need to cease treating the partner as a representative of their gender role. We must stop fighting the pillar of stoicism or the emotional conductor. We must learn to see the human entity beneath the costume, the individual carrying the specific burdens of their upbringing, history, and unique fears, Peace begins when we choose to believe that the person across the table, despite their occasional withdrawal or defensiveness, is as afraid as we are. They are also seeking security, also craving to be seen, and also terrified that their essential value will be judged and found wanting. The quiet war is fueled by assumptions. Peace is fueled by deliberate human curiosity. In the next unit, we will explore the primary battlefield where this fear is expressed: communication. We will analyze how the inner quiet war translates into the emotional silence that suffocates true intimacy. Remain open to this truth. The reflection is never easy, but it is necessary for peace. Focus on your breath. Notice the simple honesty of the air moving in and out, a direct, non-ambiguous communication with the world. The quiet war is waged most fiercely through the misuse of silence. Silence, in the context of the relationship, is rarely empty. It is often full of unexpressed accusations, fear, and accumulated resentment. This silence is a weapon of defense, designed to prevent vulnerability. When a deep-seated fear exists, direct speech becomes too risky. We resort to a language of indirection, the active role of destructive silence. Destructive silence operates in two main ways, both rooted in self-protection, ambiguity. This is the act of talking around the core issue. One partner may use veiled hints, passive aggression, or generalized complaints, forcing the other to guess the real source of pain. This ambiguity protects the speaker from the potential rejection that comes with direct emotional honesty. However, it simultaneously creates a climate of anxiety and confusion for the listener, confirming their fear that communication with the other is fundamentally unsafe or a riddle. Avoidance, the emotional withdrawal. This is the stark retreat into functional silence. When faced with the partner's pain or the need for deep dialogue, one person shuts down, often claiming, "I'm fine," or "I don't want to fight." This withdrawal is the ultimate defense mechanism against the fear of fragility. Unit 2. By refusing to engage, the person protects their internal resources. But they communicate a devastating message to the partner: "I value my safety more than our connection." In both instances, the silence is not a void. It is a loud, negative statement that suffocates intimacy. The quiet war persists because we prioritize the logic of our defense over the emotional need of our partner. The call for courageous listening, the only true countermeasure to the language of silence, is courageous listening. Courageous listening is not waiting for your turn to speak, nor is it listening to prepare your rebuttal or construct your defense against a perceived accusation. It is the act of listening to understand the terror that motivates the other person's language, whether they are speaking or remaining silent. It requires both parties to make a radical, philosophical choice, to temporarily suspend their own fear in order to create a safe harbor for the other's pain. The person who has feared losing autonomy must risk being honest about their needs, trusting that their voice will not be erased. The person who has feared showing fragility must risk lowering their shield, trusting that their pain will be met with acceptance, not judgment. Courageous listening is the first step in dismantling the inherited fear because it teaches us a fundamental truth. You are not your gender's representative. You are a fellow human seeking security. By listening to the human being across the table, we neutralize the historical enemy we expected to find. This courage to speak and to listen without defense is the essence of redefining strength. In the final units, we will transition to the resolution, how this vulnerability transforms from a terrifying risk into the sole pathway to lasting peace. Breathe slowly. Imagine placing all the heavy, silent armor you have carried onto the ground. Let it go. The path to peace requires the courage to dismantle the defensive fortresses built from fear. This begins with a profound personal choice to redefine strength. The old definition of strength, stoic endurance, emotional concealment, and rigid self-sufficiency, is what fueled the quiet war. This strength was a prison, separating us from the very connection we sought. The new definition of strength is the courage of vulnerability. This new strength means choosing to speak your truth without resorting to the old defenses of accusation or ambiguity. It means allowing your partner to witness your moments of doubt, not as an invitation for judgment, but as an act of ultimate trust. When you choose vulnerability, you are signaling, I am willing to risk being hurt because I value our truth more than my protection. Building the bridge of empathy, redefining strength opens the door to authentic dialogue. This dialogue is founded on two pillars of recognition: recognizing the shared burden. True dialogue means stepping out of the gendered script and recognizing that the partner across from you is carrying their own unique psychological and historical burdens. Unit 4. When he withdraws, ask, what fragile part of himself is he protecting right now? When she pushes for emotional clarity, ask, what historical pattern of erasure is she afraid of repeating? Dialogue becomes an exercise in mutual empathy, not mutual accusation. The mutual path to safety, the ultimate resolution to the quiet war, is the creation of shared safety. Neither side can disarm until they are certain that the other will not use their vulnerability as a weapon. This safety is built through small, consistent acts of non-defensive listening and validation. When a partner expresses pain, the response should not be, that's not my fault, but I hear your pain. Tell me more. This simple act of validating the other's emotional reality is the most powerful antidote to the fear of being erased or misunderstood. The goal of this resolution is not to achieve perfect harmony, but to achieve authentic peace, a state where difference is viewed not as a threat, but as an opportunity for profound and safe connection. This is the final, essential philosophical lesson. The quiet war ends when we realize that the strongest thing we can offer is not our defenses, but our humanity. In our final unit, we will synthesize this journey, guiding this deep wisdom into the final, restful surrender of sleep. Gently, slowly come back to this soft, dark space. Let the weight of the world, the burdens of history, and the quiet anxieties of the day all melt away beneath you. We began by seeking to understand the quiet war, the tension of fear and misunderstanding that separates two halves destined for connection. We traveled through the deep channels of inherited history and the psychological walls of competence and autonomy. The profound truth we uncovered is this: the war is not between genders. It is between fear and truth. The defensive masks, the stoic withdrawal, the hypervigilance, the language of ambiguity were all built on the misunderstanding that strength lies in concealment. Yet our journey has shown us that true, enduring strength is found only in the courage to surrender the fortress. Imagine that fortress now. See its tall, silent walls. Recognize that they were built not to keep the enemy out, but to keep the vulnerability in. Now, with a quiet exhale, allow those heavy stones to crumble, releasing the pressure they held for so long. You are safe. The ultimate security you seek is not to be found in the perfect, non-threatening behavior of the other, but in the unconditional acceptance of your own human frailty, the birth of inner stillness. This final realization that peace begins with the self is the most soothing antidote to the quiet war. When you cease fighting the battle to control the other's perception of you, you find yourself utterly, beautifully free. When you recognize that your own worth is not conditional on your performance or your ability to maintain a mask, you release the core tension that makes communication a threat. Allow this profound sense of self-acceptance to wash over your mind. You are enough. Your history is valid. Your fears are acknowledged. Let the final threads of analysis and philosophy dissolve. You do not need to solve the world's problems tonight. You only need to rest from them. The journey is complete. The wisdom is integrated. There is nothing left to hold on to, nothing left to defend, and no one left to fight. The quiet war ends, not with a treaty, but with the stillness of a heart finally unafraid. Sink now. Surrender your weight to the bed, your thoughts to the quiet air, and your vigilance to the certainty of safety. You are held. You are whole, peace. Drift deeply now and rest.